Anyone on Zoom has a joy or concern to share?
One WVPE and WVPE HD1 Elkhart South End. Fountain stage with guest host Heather Knighton, please.
Rich Ma, can you unmute?
Okay. Have a good friend, Rich Ma, he, him, have a good friend in Seattle starting aggressive chemotherapy tomorrow for breast cancer and sure to lose her hair, sure to become sick from the side effects. Right in the middle of selling their house, she and her husband, and moving into an adult facility. So not great timing. And my memory of the AIDS era is my career was with the Social Security Administration. We dealt with many disability claims and death claims during that time. It's part of giving talks to different groups. You know, had to overcome some of the people who were poo-pooing it and
Hello, I'm Joseph Gress. These are my reflections on coming out as gay in the middle of the AIDS crisis. I grew up in a large Catholic family on a dairy farm in Kansas. As a child and a young teenager, following the teachings of the Catholic Church came pretty naturally. However, like virtually every teenager, as soon as puberty kicked in, everything changed, and I became intensely curious about sex. Now, those years can be confusing, I think, for every teenager, but I think especially for gay teens. I was 14 years old in 1970, and I spent much of the next decade gradually discovering and realizing that I was gay. There were very few models of what it meant to be a gay man at that time. One memory that I have was when I was living in St. Louis. I read a newspaper article about a police sting operation in Forest Park. Several men had been arrested for soliciting sex with other men. The article portrayed the park as a notorious place where anonymous encounters occurred. The message was unmistakable. If you act on your feelings, you risk arrest, public humiliation, and the loss of your career. That newspaper story was one of the only models of gay life that I had at that time. And it was terrifying, but also strangely compelling. I knew there had to be something better, but I had no idea how to find it. But I read a lot, and by the early 1980s, I had finally begun to say to myself, I think I'm gay. For me, coming out was not a single event, but a journey that unfolded over many years. It included recognizing my sexual orientation, working with a therapist, beginning to explore relationships with other men, and gradually coming out to friends, family, and I have thousands of siblings, and coming out to my parents. Most of that journey took place between 1983 and 1988 while I was in graduate school in Kansas. And that was right when AIDS was taking off. The first report on CBS News that you just saw, I think I saw that report. I watched CBS News almost every night, and I just remember hearing about it. And I mean, there was not a lot of reporting, but I paid it. I knew that something was going on that was very dangerous. And throughout the 1980s, the epidemic accelerated. I just want to give a few statistics. In 1982, 500 Americans died, most of them young men in their 20s and 30s. In 1985, that number was 7,000. By 1988, 11,000. At the peak of the epidemic, before there was good treatments in 1994, 50,000 Americans died in 1 year from AIDS. And at the same time, another battle was unfolding. This was the beginning of what came to be known as the culture wars. Political and religious leaders and cultural commentators increasingly portrayed openly gay and lesbian people like myself as threats to American society. And at that time, I was still an active member of the Catholic Church. As I was beginning to accept who I was, many of the voices many of the voices I had trusted throughout my life were telling me that people like me were morally disordered and responsible for the AIDS epidemic. I didn't believe them, but it was still hard to reconcile my spiritual beliefs with the realization that I was gay. Despite all of that, life moves forward. By 1988, I met Ron. By then, I had experienced several meaningful relationships, but with Ron, I found the lifelong partner that I'd been hoping for. In 1992, we celebrated our commitment ceremony, an act of hope at a time when many gay couples were instead attending hospital bedsides and funerals. When I think back on the AIDS era, I remember the fear, the staggering loss of life, and the prejudice that many people endured. But I also remember, even more clearly, the extraordinary courage of ordinary people who chose love over fear, who cared for friends when others would not, and who insisted that gay people deserve dignity, compassion, and the chance to build loving families.
Thank you for the days, those endless days, those sacred days you gave me, thinking of the days I won't forget a single day, believe me.
Now, for a moment of meditation, I invite you to settle into your body. Let your shoulders drop a little and get comfortable. And take a slow inhale, not an impressive one, just be present. Feel your ribs widen. Pause gently at the top. Exhale through your mouth like you're softening a window with breath. Now bring your attention to the quiet center of your chest, that place where intention gathers, where your dignity resides, where your own being lives. Imagine a small, steady light there, not bright, not dramatic, simply present. Inhale. Let that light expand. Exhale. Let it settle like a lantern, and find its balance. Feel yourself held in this light, connected with those beside you, to those you carry in memory, to those who taught you how to love. As we return to the room with that small light still warm in your chest.
I bless the light. I bless the light that shines on you, believe me. And though you're gone, you're with me every single day, believe me.
I guess I am what you call a late bloomer. And being a late bloomer probably saved my life. I went to college in the San Francisco Bay Area, and at that time, I hadn't figured out that being gay was at the center of who I am. At the same time, this mysterious cancer, or AIDS, had hit the world and was spreading fast in big urban areas. In 1983, I moved from California to rural Michigan to get my degree in counseling psychology. This move got me out of one of the epicenters where AIDS was spreading fast. Post-divorce, I finally came out and garnered the courage to be truthful about my sexual orientation. This process took a lot of answering questions and dealing with a lot of fear many had. For me, besides dealing with my own fear about coming out. It was hard coming out as gay in the late 80s. AIDS was on the nightly news, and the Christian right labeled it as the gay disease and God's retribution on the gay community for our immoral ways. The question that would follow after I said, I am a gay man, was, aren't you afraid of getting AIDS? As if the two automatically walked hand in hand. Then I would answer talking about safe sex, being tested, questions that worried family, friends, and colleagues never had to answer themselves when they were acting on their romantic or sexual feelings. I lost my place, just a second. Yes, thank you. Well, as a world community, we were trying to understand this strange new disease that was killing so many within my gay community. We were emotionally wrung out from all the loss. We were losing our partners and friends. We also wondered if this strange virus would take us out as well. many of us were afraid. And if that weren't enough, many of us were attacked by churches, the media, the government, and our own families. It was astounding that AIDS gave many the right to blame and shame us. But our community banded together through ACT UP protesting the Reagan government and turning a blind eye and refusing to help. Artists and musicians banded together to create a message of hope and love in honoring the losses we were experiencing. Many of us remember the creation of the National AIDS Memorial Quilt project, which ended up sewing together 50,000 panels and honored 105,000 names as a physical reminder of all those individuals whose lives were lost to AIDS. One of the most moving for me was the Turtle Creek Chorale, a gay man's chorus in Dallas, whose director wrote a requiem and combined a Mass of the Dead and the 5 stages of grief developed by Kubler-Ross. It honors all feelings of our community trying to come to terms with this disease that was taking from us so many members of our community. Here is an excerpt from Acceptance and Hope. I shall miss loving you. I shall miss the comfort of your embrace. I shall miss the loneliness of waiting for the calls that never came. I shall miss the joy of your comings and the pain of your goings, and after a time, I shall miss loving you. And through all the tears and the sadness and the pain comes the one thought that can make me internally smile again. I have loved. The LGBTQ plus community continues to face many challenges. Throughout our history, it has been love, understanding, and banding together with our community and our allies that have carried us through. Love is the spirit of the LGBTQ plus community, and just like it is within the UU Church. What a great refuge love is when it is put into action for all who are ostracized.
Days I'll remember all my life. Days when you can't see wrong from right. You took my life, and then I knew that very soon you'd leave me. But it's all right, and now I'm not frightened of this world, believe me.
Good morning. Before I begin my prepared text, this was really difficult for many reasons, and I have a lot of unprocessed stuff, and so I get overwhelmed sometimes just even looking back at these times. But there's one thing that comes up a lot, and it's anger, and sometimes it's at my own community. Because when the AIDS crisis first came, the first people to the ramparts were the kink people and the trans people, because they were already ostracized. They already had networks of support, and they were there. And, the idea that these folks, that there are some who would continue to marginalize these people, just angers me so much. So I want to get that out of the way. And I'm not going to talk a lot about history because you can look that up. And I wanted to make this a little bit more personal. But yeah, it's hard, and I'm going to leave a lot out. But when I arrived in New York City in 1983, the city vibrated with possibility for me, but also with fear. The AIDS epidemic was no longer a rumor or a whisper. It was everywhere. In the newspapers, in the hospitals, in the conversations on the street, it was in the faces of friends, neighbors, strangers. It shaped the air we breathe. The young man that arrived, well, I was part of a very common story. Having grown up in a rural upstate New York, attended an equally rural college, and thought of New York as the place I could finally be free. And despite a community in chaos around me, I did find my people, my friends, my lovers, my boyfriends. By 1986, the epidemic had grown even more devastating. Friends were getting sick, entire social circles were disappearing. The fear was still there, but something else had begun to rise in me, the sense that simply watching was no longer enough. I needed to do something. I needed to show up. So I began volunteering with Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, the first organization of its kind in the world. We were inventing care as we went. There was no roadmap, no training manual for how to accompany people through a disease that had no cure, no treatment, and no clear future. What we had were each other, and we had love and stubbornness and the belief that no one should face this alone. And you have to remember, we're talking about boys, men in their 20s, in their 30s, this is new, that people came to the cities, San Francisco, Chicago, Los Angeles, New York, to live a dream that was never possible until they got there. And now many of them were ill. And GMHC taught me that community is not an abstract idea. It's a practice. It is meals delivered, hospital visits made, phone calls answered at 2 a.m., and the quiet courage of sitting beside the bed of someone who is dying and refusing to let them feel abandoned. During this work, I met 3 men who shaped me forever: Barry, Will, and Brian. Barry came to New York from Tennessee to dance. He carried the unmistakable dancer's posture. Even when illness began to take his strength, he held himself in a kind of fragile elegance. AIDS ravaged his body, and hepatitis made everything worse. His latent bipolar disorder intensified under the strain, and there were days when the world felt too heavy for him to bear. But even as his body failed him, his creativity refused to die. Between doctor's visits and hospitalizations, he created a home business in his tiny studio apartment. He made candles decorated with dried flowers, which he carefully packaged and sold to gift shops around town. As his health worsened, his very conservative religious parents would visit and help care for him and give him what money they could. They really were wonderful to him. Barry eventually moved back to his hometown into a small home on his parents' street. He died in 2015, and his parents died shortly after. I like to think that they found whatever peace comes in lives marked by struggle, creativity, and love. Will was a designer. He came from a small town in Ohio and went to the Parsons School of Design and graduated with an unmistakable talent. Fashion was his love. While still a student, he won awards in Paris that have never before been given to an American, and his career was just beginning to bloom when AIDS struck him down. He designed women's fashion, and he kept creating. When fashion became too physically demanding, Will turned to interior design. And he had a steady flow of commissions for apartment renovations, and his clients adored his eye, the way he could make a small place feel intentional, elegant, and alive. In his last year, working even an hour or 2 a day required him to take a stimulant just to give him enough energy to focus. Eventually, the anti-inflammatories he needed robbed his hips and spine of calcium, leaving him to constant, unbearable pain. He faced a future where his creativity would be trapped inside a body that could no longer support it. Will chose to take his own life, surrounded by his friends who loved him. It was a decision made from clarity, not despair, a final act of agency, and a life where illness had taken so much. His death was heartbreaking, but it was gentle, held in community, and shaped by the same intentionality he brought to his art. Brian came to New York to be an actor. We bonded over science fiction, fellow book nerds. Together, we formed a gay science fiction reading club, and we often traveled to sci-fi conventions together. Brian was a gentle man with a gentle lover partner. Back in 1980, he told me, before anything was known about AIDS, he and his partner had each agreed to hook up with someone else they were attracted to. This one time was enough, and Brian became symptomatic in 1987. Meanwhile, Brian joined the Hetrick Martin Institute, an organization serving gay youth, and worked for the Harvey Milk School, a public school specifically for at-risk queer youth. He believed in building futures he knew he might never live to witness. Brian taught me that courage is sometimes quiet, administrative, and profoundly generous. He showed me that activism is not only protest, but it's also creation and work. Brian is the closest I ever had to an adult mentor, showing me how to be an adult queer man. I miss him so much. I want to be clear, I'm not attempting a history lesson here. I'm simply telling some stories worth telling. Some stories are too painful to tell. The sights and smells of St. Vincent's Hospital, hallways full of men struggling with their lives, some abandoned, some surrounded by friends and chosen family, and one whole corridor of rooms devoted to Roman Catholic priests with AIDS. The same institution that was publicly silent, even condemning, was quietly taking good care of everyone behind these doors. The contradictions of that time were everywhere. And then there were the families. Some were heartbroken but steadfast, caring for their sons to the very end with a kind of fierce, unconditional love. And others swooped in like vultures after death, claiming their son's property and evicting partners who had cared for them. This was before marriage, before these legal protections. Barry, Will, and Brian were three very different men, a dancer, a designer, and an actor, but their lives formed a kind of constellation for me. Each one showed a different facet of what is meant to live, love, and struggle in the AIDS years. Barry taught me about fragile beauty. Will taught me about intentional creation. Brian taught me about quiet courage and building a future for others. Their stories were not isolated tragedies. They were part of a vast, interconnected community, thousands of lives, thousands of losses, each one shaping the moral landscape of the time. As I accompanied them, I began to understand something essential, that the AIDS movement had two arms and two necessary responses, two forms of love. One was care and one was protest, and both were really necessary. Gay Men's Health Crisis, where I volunteered, was the caregiving arm. It was tenderness organized into structure. It was meals delivered, hospital visits made, legal help offered, counseling provided, and companionship given to people who had been abandoned by their families, their churches, their government. GMHC is where I met people like Barry, Will, and Brian, and they found dignity there. It was where we learned compassion is not a feeling, it is a discipline. It is showing up again and again, even when you're tired, even when you are grieving, even when you are afraid. And GMHC taught me that love is logistical. Love is a phone call returned. Love is a ride to the clinic. Love is sitting beside someone who is dying and refusing to let them be alone. But care wasn't enough. People were dying too fast, government moving too slowly. The other arm of the movement rose out of fury, righteous, disciplined, strategic fury. ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power, became the political arm. They shut down the FDA. They disrupted a mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. They lay down in the streets with their names of the dead pinned to their chests. They forced the country to look at what was happening. They forced drug companies to accelerate research. They forced hospitals to change protocols. They forced politicians to act. If GMHC was compassion, ACT UP was confrontation. GMHC was caregiving, ACT UP was accountability. GMHC held the dying, ACT UP fought for the living, and both were necessary. Together, GMHC and ACT UP formed a full body of the AIDS movement. Tenderness and rage, caregiving and activism, love expressed in two different languages. The men I cared for lived at the intersection of those forces. Barry, Will, and Brian needed the meals, the counseling, the companionship, but they also needed the protests, the policy changers, the pressures that ACT UP applied. They needed both arms of the movement to survive as long as they did. And I learned that to be part of a community in crisis is to hold both truths at once. We care for one another. We fight for one another. I tell these stories not to reopen old wounds, but to remind us what community looks like when the stakes are high. The AIDS years taught me that we belonged to one another, not in theory, but in practice. We're responsible for each other's dignity, each other's safety, and each other's hope. Most all the men I loved from that time are gone, but what they taught me remains. They taught me that compassion is a discipline, that justice is a form of love, that showing up for the sick, for the grieving, for the vulnerable is holy work. They taught me that every community, including ours, faces moments when we must decide who we are, moments when care is required, moments when courage is required, moments when both are required at once. My stories are from another era, but the call that they carry is timeless. To hold one another close, to fight for one another's lives, and that never forget that love, practiced fiercely, can change the world.